This is a Parshat podcast brought to you by Matan Women's Institute for Torah Study, and I'm your host, Yosefa Fogel-Rubel. Let's learn. Welcome back to our Shmot series, First Principles of Nationhood, where we're exploring what axiomatic ideas sit at the root of Israel's national formation, without which we wouldn't be who we are. How might we adjust our current trends in the Jewish world to realign with these principles? For those of you who love listening weekly, sponsoring an episode is a wonderful way to show your gratitude for the high-level content we try and put out each week. Be in touch with us at podcast@matan.org.il or with the Matan office to sponsor some of the Shmot episodes. In Parshat Mishpatim, we receive our first major collection of laws. The collection's opening addresses slavery, likely because it's a category close to the hearts of recently freed slaves, and moves on to topics such as kidnapping, harm to a pregnant woman, damage to crops, and thievery. There is a brief address of laws regulating one's relationship with the divine, a brief hint to the deeper purpose for creating a society based on these stipulations in this detailed-oriented parsha, the prohibition to utilize sorcery, and then discussion of the proper treatment of weaker members of society, the poor, orphaned, and widowed. Principles also deeply connected to our experience as the weak members of Egyptian society. Monumental guidelines regarding judicial integrity, as well as how we should treat our enemies, are also included. The Parsha ends in chapter 24 with the ratification of this covenant with God. It is essentially the closure of the Sinai experience, replete with the nations gathering, a meal, and God's invitation to Moshe to come to the heavens and receive the Luchot. Today's guest is new to our podcast, Professor Chaim Saiman, who is a professor of law and chair in Jewish law at Villanova University. His areas of expertise include Jewish law, insurance law, and private law. He sits as a dayan with the Beit Din of America and serves as an expert witness in insurance law and Jewish law in federal court. He is the author of Halakhic, the rabbinic idea of law, has authored many articles in this field, and is working on a book on the American Beit Din system. Professor Chaim Saiman, it's a pleasure to have you on the podcast.
Thank you so much. It's an honor to be here.
I'm really excited that you're here. I said before we began this conversation that I'm also excited that we really have somebody here today who's really coming from a little bit of a different background, and we're going to hear a little bit about what that means. This sort of combination of academia and also this Torah world and halacha world. I just wanted to open and say that I actually discovered your book first, sharing with my audience. Sometimes they love to hear how these podcasts kind of get curated. I discovered your book, I think, about 5 years in delay after it had actually come out, and started reading it and was completely fascinated, and then had a great time just reaching out and got excited to be able to speak with you. I just wanted to share with our audience that this book, which you can order on Amazon, as far as I saw, is a great book because, especially for those living in the system, it sort of takes a bird's eye view of what halacha is or isn't, sort of the interesting blurred line between halacha as an act of learning Torah and halacha as an act that also is regulating our Torah life. And for me, was a very refreshing way to sort of take a more objective look at the system that I'm actually inside of. And I felt that, like, as someone who's on the inside, and as you are also someone, quote unquote, on the inside, it was a really great opportunity to feel like I got perspective on the system that I'm in. I also thankfully teach a lot of these sources that are halakhic, also agadic, also in the Gemara. And I also felt like I was able to give really great language for that. So also there's plenty of people who listen to this podcast that are teachers. And I also wanted to share with them that I think this is a really, really a great resource in order to help us really refine our thinking about what halacha is and also what halacha isn't. So first of all, thank you. Thank you for putting out this book that also, I don't know, it sort of also straddles the academic world, but is extremely accessible, I think, to the lay person. I'm considering myself a lay person in this case.
Thank you. Thanks so much. So first, yes, in the following sense. So I wanted to write, I'm a professor, as you noted, I want to write an academic book, but I don't think there's any reason that academic books should be unreadable, despite the fact that is sometimes the trend. So I really spent a lot of time, not just on the ideas, but trying to write it in a way that certainly a person who either lives a halachic life or sort of knows the basic parameters of it could understand it. And that people who think about law and legal theory could understand it. And I always say, if you know one of those things, I would hope this book is for you. So I appreciate that. I also, as you can tell, some of it grows out of my own teaching, thinking through sugiyot, thinking of what we're doing. One way to think about it is I teach in a law school, and I teach contracts, as you mentioned, and I was learning a section of Baba Basra with my chavrusa at night, and I realized, I basically did the same thing twice today in some ways that are very, very similar, and in some ways that are radically different. And that got me thinking about, well, how are these the same? How are they different? You mentioned the axiomatic ideas that make us a people. I believe that was your language in the introduction. And what this book grows out of is like, this little bit autobiographical, a little bit frustration, a little bit wanting to kind of figure out who you are and what you're doing in the world. And I was on a panel once early on in my career with people from other legal systems and other religions, and it was one of those like law and religion panels. And I was asked, well, what are the what special rules of law does Judaism have that and I think people were expecting, and I myself was expecting to think of some like rule of contract law, or some rule of tort law, or some rule of criminal law, or something like that. And the more I thought about it, I was like, it's actually not that. That Chazal's biggest innovation is that the study of law is a religious is a religious experience, and maybe at the heart of the religious experience. And this is a very, as he said, very common for us within it. Of course, Talmud Torah Keneged Kulam, everyone knows that. But like, stop, that's really weird in the sense that no other legal system asserts that the study of it is some sort of universal goal. Right? I teach my students; they're law students. Um, they have economic interests, maybe even they have political interests, maybe they have, sort of like interest in bringing justice to the world. But it's not interested per se to there's a mitzvah of every a member of American society or any other society to be conversant in the finer details of bankruptcy law, of corporate law, of contract law, in the ways that roughly Tavatsiya Babakam Basra. On the other hand, moving to religions, certainly nothing in the Christian world looks like this. It's sort of a universal ideal of education and knowledge in the finer details of the legal system. A little bit closer in Islamic law, but not quite the same way. So we have here something, it's hard to say the word unique because the world's a very big place. But I think in the emphasis and structure that it appears in Yahadut, this emphasis on Talmud Torah is unique. And therefore, one of the questions is, what does it do to your law? And what does it do to your religion? When the study of law, both for functional and non-functional purposes, occupies such a large space. And that is, in a certain sense, what this book is trying to grapple with. What is it? How does it work? What is its origins? And then what implications it has.
Yeah.
I'll just say I'm not, you probably have many people on who are professors of Madei Yahadut in broad sense, that come up through a system, an academic training that emphasizes certain things. I come from a law school world, which we think about different questions and use different methods. I think one way to think about this is a book of Jewish law that's not from the Talmud department, that's not from the Shevet Israel department, but from a very different place, from the place of a yeshiva in part, and from a place from an American law school in part.
Yeah, no, and it's completely felt, meaning that's very much the experience that I had reading it. And the historians you're bringing in are historians of law, right? Meaning there's a whole different world of expertise that's coming in, and you really feel that. And that's what I said. I felt like you really gave like a very different perspective than I normally would have. So we're gonna, again, obviously in honor of Parshat Mishpatim, which is our classic parsha with the greatest amount of laws. That's actually not true, but meaning with the not true at all, actually. But in honor of Parshat
first parsha with lots of laws.
The first parsha with lots of laws. So I really wanted to have someone on here who really has much to say about these laws. And I think that we're going to get into also to hear more about actually the multidisciplinary way that you function also in the world. But maybe first bring us a little bit into this transition between Yitro and Mishpatim, right? There's such a stark contrast between these two parshiot. And I'd love to hear also what you think about the juxtaposition between the two of them.
Yeah, thanks. So this also a number of years ago, and again, Villanova, you didn't mention, maybe your audience knows, is a Catholic school, a Catholic university, and the law school, has some bearing in that. So often when we talk about law and religion, that is the frame that's used. And there was a conference hosted by one of my colleagues called the Moral Foundations of the Law, which is a very Christian way to think about it. And I was asked to speak. So I immediately, went to Parshat Yitro, which is before Parshat Mishpatim, and I noticed something that to me really struck me is that there's the called the conventional introduction to Matan Torah, which is Shmos Perek Yud Tet, which basically God appears to Bnei Israel in thunder and lightning, and they are afraid, and that is the point, right? And God sort of repeats this that part of the awesomeness of this ma'amad is to induce fear and ultimately compliance. And Moshe himself has to basically become almost unhuman in order to be the mediator between HaKadosh Baruch Hu and Bnei Israel, and that is emphasized. And then when the Jews are afraid, that's seen as the point, right? Hagbalah, right? It's all about boundaries and borders and separation, and that is the Ma'amad of Har Sinai. And in that, when you think about that as an introduction to Har Sinai and ultimately Mishpatim, it is one of transcendence, right? It's that God is very, very far, awesome in the original sense of that word, um, and the kind of Moshe's sort of the point of contact almost has to become non-human, and that's what law is, and I think corresponds to something deep within within the Halakhic way of thinking, and the Halakhic experience, that sort of the law is not from here, it is not ours, it is something that is imposed from above, and basically your only reaction is, as we say, Naaseh v'nishma. But then, if you look just one parak earlier, we have something totally different, right? We have the story of Yitro coming to Moshe in the Midbar, and here, first of all, Moshe seems very human, because what is more human than being there and having your father-in-law come and criticize you at your work? Arguably one of the most human experiences possible. He also seems a little in over his head. We see here basically an administrative system that is not well tuned and that needs some outside advice to make work. Beyond that, of course, as a number of Mefarshim in the Gemara itself in Zvachim discuss, wait a minute, if we don't have the laws yet, right, how do we already have this whole system that's not only so developed, but developed enough that our courts are overcrowded and motions overwhelmed? So there's different answers given to this in the Mefarshim and the Gemara. But to me, it's interesting. This is a very different conception of what law is, right? It's very human. It corresponds to very practical human affairs. It's about governance. It's not transcendent. Even an outsider who's not reared in the system has what to say. And then I started wondering, this is very interesting, right? There's like two Hakdamot in Matan Torah, each stressing something very, very different. And maybe that's the point, right? That we're supposed to, in classic dialectian style, sort of understand that the true halacha is some mix of Moshe as Nivdal and Nisgav, and Bimshel Chayavel only Hema Bahar, right? That you can't even begin to approach the divine. And on the other hand, something that is so in here within us that even an outsider has what to say, and he's right.
Yeah, I think also really the Matan Torah experience is flanked by that, meaning it opens with the apparent details that are overwhelming, and then it's bookended on the other side with the details that are overwhelming, meaning it's
Sure.
both a double introduction and also there's the bookends of the system on each of these sides. In past conversations, we've spoken a lot about the other, and that there's this constantly this figure within the Torah that often Dafka on the outside is able to illuminate the system, which by the way, a little bit relates to what we said before, even about your book, but also about an academic setting, meaning there's something really fruitful a lot of times in taking something that someone is really entrenched in and bringing it in some sort of external perspective, whether that's studying it in a way that you have to take yourself out of the text or the system in order to look at it in that context, which to me is one of the best advantages of academic study of anything, is that you're forced to kivyachol, pull yourself out of that space, even though obviously you can't fully do that. But that there's always an advantage to that of somebody seeing things from the outside, and that when people think that they really get it, no, I got it, I got this handled, right? It's usually a great opportunity that they should have someone observe and see what's happening, because usually we just can't. We can't actually hold both of those spaces. So yeah, it's a really important point that like Mishpatim is in a tremendous particular context. And as you said, law has this dual sense. It both is the details that can be highly overwhelming, even for Moshe Rabbeinu. Stam, I know he was really overwhelmed by the lines, but the details are overwhelming, and also it's not ours, and that there's this tension that we're going to constantly hold between trying to figure out those details are, while also like keeping a certain boundary from that and saying that our hands, we can be creative until a certain point. It's going to be the tension that I think even may still persist today within the halachic system.
So.
In the way that we want to think about law today, I think actually we're going to begin by thinking about it from its much further development. Already sort of in the Talmudic system, we'll find a way back to this week's parsha. But the system is highly unique, right? And there are laws that we have in the Torah that Chazal creatively are dorish in ways that we don't ever actually apply them. There's laws that are clearly, as we know, not in the Torah, and that Chazal have elaborated on a system which is very much how we're fulfilling it today. And I guess I'd love for you to try and explain also, again, in the way that you've sort of made this more accessible for our audience, what does that actually look like? Meaning, what does it mean to have a law system where there are laws that aren't applied, right? There, again, these are languages, we're using words in English that we're familiar with from legal systems that we know today, but they function utterly differently in the halachic system. So what does that look like?
Yeah, so this word law, right, is a very simple but kind of complicated idea, right? Um, let's kind of take two poles, right? One pole is the only thing that is law is something that comes from a state with a very clear sort of mechanism for producing it and for enforcing it. And that basically you would say in the modern world, only states have legal systems, everything else is not. Sort of at the other end of the spectrum is that any kind of shared set of social norms may be called law, right? So that who is allowed to sit next to who in the high school cafeteria is also a form of law, right? There are rules, they're being negotiated, they're being structured, and they organize, they organize a community. So I like to think that, being at either edge is not so good. I like to be somewhere in the middle. And in that sense, I would say that even today, and let's leave aside the questions of Eretz Yisrael and Halakha, but even in Galut or historically, Halakha was a legal system because it organized behavior in Jewish communities to some degree, but that doesn't mean that a legal system has to be an exclusive legal system or the only thing going on or covering with no gaps. So that is a general question in sort of legal theory. Now, one of the interesting things about halakha, as you said, looking not so much from the Mikra, but from the Mishnah and the Talmud, is that usually in the study of legal systems, we see that they come to their fruition and they rise in prominence and importance as the political power of the underlying community grows. So Roman law in the ancient world is super important because Rome is super important, right? If we go to more modern times, the 19th century English law, French law, Spanish law were all very, very important as those countries became powerful themselves and colonized the world. In the 20th century, of course, American law looms large. And today, every big law school has a course in Chinese law, in Indian law, Russian law, right? In other words, that the more important the social and political base of the sponsoring community, the more important it's law. Now, halakha, something very strange happens, almost the opposite. So historians debate the exact details, but we certainly know that the fruitful era of halakha is not in response to sovereignty, but in response, or at least in the absence of sovereignty, and maybe in some ways in the response to the loss of sovereignty. So right away, we have something very, very different that, again, it's hard to think of other examples that way, that it's the Mishnah and then the Gemara, are doing the law, whether those institutions they're talking about, Sanhedrin, Mikdash, Korbanot, etc., exist or not. More than that, when one learns within the system itself, of course, the Mishnah knows that the Beis HaMikdash usually is not standing, and certainly by the time we're in the Gemara, they know that. But it matters much less than one thinks it would. I always like to say that the very first Mishnah in Shas, right, is already indicative of this. And I write this in the book, that we start with Mei Masai Koren Kriya Shema Ba'arvit, which is something that not only, we don't have to speculate because the Mishnah itself tells us a ma'aseh of Rabbi Gamliel's sons who come home and they're discussing, the details about when to read Shema. Now, by the time we're Rabbi Gamliel, Rabbi Lesser, we know that we're post-Mikdash. And yet, in the very same Mishnah, we start talking about Mishasha Kohanim Nichnas and L'chol B'Trumatan. That isn't happening at the moment. We talk about Hektel Chalavim Ve'Ivarim on the Mizbeach, which is no longer happening. So right away, it's like, Page one, or I should say page two, already tells us that like we're here in the middle of some complicated system in which what to a contemporary lawyer and in a different way to a historian, the central question is, did this happen? Did this govern? That is not the question. The question is, this is a system of interrelated concepts that it has its toe always one side in something that could be very practical and concrete, could be something that's completely theoretical, and that the lines are fluid and blurry and don't seem to bother the system itself in a way that I think to us is sometimes maddening.
I
But
mean,
I think we have to say that that's where we are.
and it's also always in the middle of the action, meaning you're always in the middle of a story. Meaning there's never, the Torah still has some more clear delineations of
Yes.
of a middle, a beginning, middle, and end. But once we get
Yes.
to Talmudic material, right, whether it's Mishnah, Gemara, and obviously the Rishonim afterwards, you're always in the middle of a story and you're always
We
inside the
go back to
story.
that Mishnah. One has to know Tvul Yom, right? If maybe Kriya Shema at night is a well-known idea, Tvul Yom is definitely not. And yet one needs to know Tvul Yom to make sense of this first Mishnah.
Exactly. And so another way that the system is really so is so utterly different is also in terms of allowance, right? We have gradations within the halachic world that are utterly different. When we speak in a regular law system, we have things that are legal and illegal, right? So maybe walk us through how that is so utterly different within the halachic system.
Yeah, and I think that these are connected. So if well, let's just like this. I always you talked about before about how two systems helps you see. So for many words in halacha, it's very clear more or less what the American law equivalent is. When it comes to two very foundational halachic concepts, we start stuttering. And this is the chatchil and b'di'evet, right? There's no great word for the chatchil b'di'evet. You could say ex post ex ante, you could say after the fact, before the fact, but they don't really capture what the chatchil and b'di'evet is. And I started to think about why is I think that is because for a modern legal system, it's ultimately trying to answer, right? Are you legally liable or not? In other words, will the state come and do or not do something? And to do that, you need an answer that is either yes or no. And if the answer is the state's going to leave you alone, right? Then whether you got by by a hair's breadth or whether you're a mile wide doesn't really matter. Halacha asks a different sort of question. We might get to, maybe we'll circle back to sort of chiyuvim bidei adam and Sanhedrin and courts and things like that. But fundamentally, you're asking, where do I stand in the eyes of God? And God has an infinite scale, right? All the way from Sadiq v'Yashar Tamim, right, to Karet and other things like that. And therefore, it's not just a Chatchil B'diavad. It's Ruach HaChamim Nocheh Himeno, Ein Ruach HaChamim Nocheh Yochai B'dinei Adam, Patur B'dinei Shemayim. Right? Nikrat Tzadik V'Chasid, or Menuval. And we could go on and on. In the book I collect as many of these different things that I could find. And what we really have is almost like an infinitely graded scale, right? Why? Because our central question is not, will the court punish you? Yeah, we have halacha about that, right? But that's not always the question because we know the courts don't punish people for lots of reasons, right? If it's a lavanitic lafe, right, then it doesn't count. If it's tashlumin, it doesn't count. If there's no edim v'hatra'ah, you don't get punished, right? So there's all sorts of reasons why you don't. So that's not the central question. I think that's why the categories are much richer or varied in halacha, not in civil law. And that's why it's very difficult to give voice to this. When I'm teaching, let's say, students, and we do some bava kama, and we come to Pater b'dinei adam, Machai b'dinei shamayim. So how do you translate that? I mean, I can translate the words, but they immediately ask, well, but like, what does that mean? And I'm like, it means that we have a different framework, is really what it means. Now, in the Achronim, they begin discussing how much bidei adam is done to enforce the b'dinei shamayim. So in some places, in some Achronim go quite far that you can kick someone out of shul and not giving it that tefillah, and basically convert. Then others disagree completely. No, pater b'dinei adam means pater b'dinei adam.
But I think that part of what you're saying, I'm just fleshing it out here, is that we're in this system for much more than checking something off or knowing if we abrogated it. Meaning all of those phrases, like Chachamim will be satisfied with a person, or they won't be satisfied with a person. There's an element here of the human conscience, right? Of like sometimes we actually like people to feel a little bit guilted, right? A lot of halachic language. I often have a hard time with those, but like right, kol machmir tavolav bracha, right? And we have these ideas that anyone who is more machmir with themselves, they're more stringent on a particular mitzvah, so they'll merit extra blessing. This is a system. First of all, I think one piece that will it's self-enforced, a lot of it, meaning most of what we do in our halachic system doesn't actually get to a court system that's considered an extreme, or it's particular areas of law that have to get to those spaces. So we have this whole sort of system of, I would say, moral rewards, or in order to encourage people to follow the system. And so it's because it's really self-policed as opposed to being something that's externally policed. And it definitely in terms of all the ritual elements of it. So I think that's also a massive part
Yeah,
here.
and I think this goes back to our non-applied halakha, right? So those of you doing daf yomi these days, right? You're enmeshed in the sugya and Sanhedrin, and pretty quickly you realize that the Sanhedrin is designed to never actually effectuate any punishments unless someone wants to be a martyr for their aver, basically. Right? So immediately one should start asking, so how does this work and what happens? And one of the things that's interesting is how little of that is asked. So there's a famous Drashot Haran asked this, right? But he's 14th century, right? Like where in a system that can obsess over the finer detail of any given point to kind of like not ask the big picture. And then, of course, that question comes back up. Certainly in the 19th century, we start thinking about other things. It's addressed in its own way within the Masechet Sanhedrin, but in very sort of episodic sort of way. So there's a good example of what I mean by law that's not applied. Not only because there is no Sanhedrin, and the Sanhedrin's Galata, and 40 years before it's Korban, it's no longer the Lishkat Hagasset. All that is true, but even in its own terms, right? If we were to follow the laws of Edom Vatra Toch Kidei Dibur, which apply not only to the death penalty but to the other penalty in the Gemara of Makos, according to Moshita, so then basically there's no punishment. So then we create this like sort of subsystem of punishments of Makas Mardus and Kippah, and we create social punishments, right? But we're always sort of jumping around here between something that is sort of the ideal system, and then like other, and then that sort of has limitations, and then we create these other categories. So then the question is, and this is sort of motivating the book, so what is the point of a law, not only that doesn't happen to apply, but is almost structurally designed not to apply? And I tie this to this other concept that we talked about, because I think they're related, of Talmud Torah, right? That sometimes the point here, which of course the Gemara already says about related things, Drush v'kabel schar, is that the act of studying is itself a way of fulfilling the law, in a way that sounds very, very foreign to a modern system, right? And very, very natural to the halakha. So if we combine these two things together, it's, as he said, what is the framework that we're sitting in? We can have laws that are applied but not in practice, right? And then we can have a series of applications that, that don't have to do with human enforcement. I think these things go together.
I'm just curious, what are other approaches to that question? Meaning your answer is that Talmud Torah is sort of this catch-all piece, so that it's, even if it's not meant to be actually lived out, it's meant to be learned, and that itself for the halachic system is actually a way of living it out, right? It's living it out in our hearts, it's living it out in our minds forever. What are some of the other ways that others have addressed this question of how does one have a law system that doesn't actually have an easy way to be applied in reality?
So I think there's basically two types of answers. One is, I think, to deny the premise that it didn't apply.
Okay.
Which is, gets you into sticky historical situations, right? But if you're going to say that when David had his Sanhedrin, right, that it looked the way it's articulated in the Sanhedrin, so then your answer is that's the way it was, that's the way it should have been, and then galut in some sort of very broad sense is what happened. I think that's probably the most traditional way. At the other end of the spectrum, you could say is that some cultures fantasize about superheroes, and some cultures fantasize about space travel, and some cultures fantasize in law. And that's what this is. This is and these are basically, I would say one is the very like traditional yeshivish approach, and one
Yeah.
is a sort of academic historical approach. And maybe bits of both of those are true as well. I kind of think that like sort of okay, maybe it is, but what does it mean to fantasize in law? Because that's not something that happens very much, and therefore, what is its impact? Because part of the point that I call them both law, right, as opposed to saying, you know, is that they could interconnect. So maybe just to take an example, so classically, right, the one of the three things that the Gemara itself tells you, at least in one opinion, was never to apply is ir hanidachat. I know we're in Parshat, not Mishpatim, but okay. Right, which the Tosefta and the Gemara quotes is already never going to happen. Okay, so you could tell a story about what is that actually about. But what's interesting is that if that is the least practiced bit of halacha, I think in every legal system, one of the most contentious questions of law is who pays taxes, right? What are the tax rates and who pays them? And then the Gemara Bava Basra, when it's trying to figure out questions of membership in the community, says Kama yeh ba'ir v'yeh mioso ha'ir. When do you basically acquire citizenship rights and responsibilities? And immediately links to the question from Ir Hanidachat about whether people traveling through are considered part of the community for Ir Hanidachat purposes. And I think this to me is like a great example of why we should both recognize the duality of the categories, but also understand the fluidity of the categories, because it takes the least practiced halacha, so much so that the Gemara tells us it's not practiced, and all of a sudden into the most practical question and the most contentious legal question of any legal system: who pays taxes and how much? And because they are all within the same sort of conceptual universe, unlike our world, where we would distinguish between law, philosophy, literature, various other forms of cultural product. And therefore, the law, one of the things it's designed to do is to keep those other things out or to filter them through the legal framework. I think in halacha, you have a much more like porous system precisely because, Malahar, Death, Hashem, and Halakhic. So then the opposite also happens. So that's the way I think about it, is that this porousness goes in two directions.
I also want to think about the side of when this is upkept, right? Meaning we mentioned earlier that you sit as a dayan and a beit din. So
Mhm.
first of all, I want you to tell us a little bit about what that looks like in the context in which you function, just on a practical level. But then I want us to think a little bit about, because it seems to be that the job of a dayan is actually to figure out how to heavily apply a lot of these
Sure.
halachic ideas.
Well, let's talk about the old space, right? So I think
Yeah.
what has defined Jewish life for centuries. Just take Shabbat and Kashrut. So I think there, right, we have a series of principles laid out in Kashrut and Chulin and Avodah Zarah, and in Shabbos, largely Masechet Shabbos. And what you see is something that looks, in some sense, very much like a legal system. There are principles, there are new cases, they get applied, and they get enforced in a certain way. Now, it's true they're not enforced through a state, right? Because again, from the Sanhedrin perspective, for Chilul Shabbos, you again need Eidim V'Atzra, but they're enforced through communal norms, right? Some of those, in centuries past had more discrete halachic parameters, right? We call them Malchus Martis, we call Cherem Stam, we can call the various sort of social sanctions, but even today, right? If you want to live within the boundaries of a firm community, and all of a sudden you're seen driving on Shabbos, like you're going to face a variety of enforcement mechanisms. I don't think that we only need to think of the police from the state as the only method of enforcement. I think when you live, certainly even in the Galut and certainly in Israel, within a fairly law, and you want to associate with that community, then it has a way of its enforcing its norms. So I would say we started with this because that's the chiddush. The halacha also has these other parts. But before we get to I'm happy to. We'll talk about the beit din and dinim mammon and all that kind of stuff in a minute. But just from what everybody understands to be the kind of core structures of Jewish life, le'orech hadorot, has been some surrounding some version of upholding halachic norms, not only learning them, not only personally applying them, but also through various public forms of social control that, to me, is a way of enforcing a legal system.
100%. I think many people, many people are keeping halacha in the way that it's been enforced by the social consent, and they rarely ever see anything written. Meaning that I think that people know much more of Tanakh they've seen inside than many people have seen halacha inside. Most people's knowledge of halacha is what they heard and what they see around them. So that's of course
Right.
true that that's much of our enforcement.
Yeah,
Um,
to go to the Beit Din.
yeah.
So part of my interest was okay. I wanted to see. All right, so when we think about not just the part now, maybe we'll say it this way, not the part of halacha that doesn't compete with the state, right? Shabbat, kashrut, but the part of halacha that arguably could compete with the state, which is dine mamonot. How does that work and what happens? So I became involved with the Best Din of America, which is you know it's its own institution, but it's largely we could say sponsored by Yeshiva University in that world a couple of years ago, and particularly when there are cases where there's a strong American law background, they like to have lawyers and law professors on the panel to sort of bring together that aspect of where it comes in and how it works. So I do that. The other thing I do in this space, which we mentioned at the top, is through that work, I've gotten really interested in understanding the structure of the banking system in America generally, which is by number largely happening in the Haredi and the para-Haredi world. And I've been researching that system through interviews with various players in that system in the greater New York area, so Muncie, Brooklyn, Lakewood, basically. As well as reading as much of the American law about the Batei Din, because of course here in America they have to, if they want enforcement through the courts, they need to sit within some sort of American context, and that is a sort of broader project that I'm in. So in sociologist speak, I'm a participant observer of this system. That's the sort of easiest way to think about it.
Okay, and in a case really of these monetary issues that are coming in, what is the balance or the dance that we see between halachic upholding of halachic principles or how they interplay with state principles? Meaning, how are we extending the halacha in that way, and where are we drawing it from exactly? Meaning, there are certain elements of the halachic system that have been highly developed in certain areas, and there's other areas where it's not so developed, and we see that because there'll just be like one Rishon who writes about it, and then it gets pulled later. I mean, I'll just give even a really, really, really relevant example in Israel in the past year and a half. All the laws of war, which essentially were not highly developed over the centuries. You have the Rambam who had his treatise, which is fascinating in itself, why the Rambam was, wrote the way he did. And then you have really a jump to there's very little written in between. You have a jump to really more modern poskim on the matter. And you have many, many rabbanim who have been sitting over the past year and a half really dealing with situations that obviously have been coming up. We've had wars and obviously in the past decades, but there were many new elements that came up in the past year and a half. I had the privilege of sitting down with a few colleagues and sitting and hearing about what that looks like. So there are some areas of law that are highly developed and there are some that are not, and then they have to be developed now. So I'm just curious, again, an example, let's say, of the law that you really, that you, and the halakha that you're sitting and presiding over more closely. What does that dance look like between the halachic
Sure,
regulation and the modern
sure.
regulation?
So it is in core Chosh and Mishpat areas. It is rarely as extreme as what you described. In other words, in Hilchot Milchama, you're really sometimes going back to the Tanakh, right? So that is not the story here, though there is a smaller version of the story. Generally, in other words, many areas of law, though not all, develop in the Gemara, of course, in the Rishonim, and into the early Achronim. If we think about the first or second wave of Nosei Kalim on the Shulchan Aruch, and those things have become somewhat standardized. However, for reasons both politically, in other words, as Jewish communities, as the Kahals began to break down in Europe, and the states in the 18th and 19th century began to absorb more authority into the state, we definitely see a kind of slowing down of this way of thinking about these problems until I would say the last generation or two when we're now in an uptick. So I would say there is a gap. It's not quite that large as it is in Dinei Milchama. No one's going back to Parshat Mishpatim to figure out a sugya of Eish. Another thing happened that not all areas are equal. So coming to our parsha, things like Aish and Bor remain fairly undeveloped, and we've had other ways to do them. Things like Dine Hodat and Halvaot and everything up to Ishtarot, already in the Rishonim is very, very developed. What we would call medieval commercial law, so Arev and Aaron Kablan and Maimon Shloshtan and things like this, transferring of debt and debt instruments is something that gets a lot of play within the walls of the Shulchan Aruch, so to speak. So not all the areas are the same, but we do have gaps. Corporate forms aren't really developed. A lot of the structure of modern finance isn't there. And I think, and part of the reason I want to study the system, and is I think we're in a period today where in 100 or 200 years, we're going to look and say these 20, 30, 40 years are really when the practices of Choshen Mishpat caught up to the economic world where Jews living. Another factor here, and this is part of my academic work, is in America, as the frum and particularly the Haredi and quasi-Haredi community becomes considerably wealthier. So you now have different classes of cases. Now there's a simple case, let's say a classic Beit Din case from 30 years ago is a Rebbe or a Mora who gets fired from the school or the yeshiva, and then they're basically arguing was the termination for cause or not? Was it under the contract or under some sort of minhag? This is a very important case for the people involved, but it's not particularly complicated. There's rarely many documents. It can be solved within a day or two. Today, you could have 30, 40, $50 million deals that are put together by lawyers, frum or not, but using the architecture of American law with all its concepts. And then, if these people may come to Beit Din when a dispute arises. And so now, sort of these questions become much, much more complex because there's this system, there's that system, and how they interact. Now here, to be frank, I would say there's some trends that have emerged across all Beit Dins, and there's some things that different Batei Din and even different Dayanim have different shitot on. I'm most comfortable speaking about what happens in Beit Din in America, although, again, these things sort of happen everywhere. I would say one common misperception is that the Dina de Malchut Dina is the main tool. It's usually not.
Right, which is, just explain that to our audience.
Sure. So Dina Malchut Dina is a principle that appears already in the Gemara. Literally translated, the Dina, the law of the Malchut, we call it the government, is Dina has some sort of halachic standing. So it's a whole range of positions as to when and how that applies. Maybe it even applies differently in America, in Chutz than in Israel. A more common way that this comes in is called minhag or minhag asochrin or minhag medina, different ways, which again, those who've learned sugyot know that already the Gemara talks about this, right? There's a workday, a halachic workday, but then the minhag might have different hours, right? So do you start sun up to sunrise, 9 to 5? Do you leave your house at sunrise, or do you get to where you're supposed to work at sunrise? And same thing on the back end, and already there, right? The sugyas in Bava Metzia are very clear that we follow the minhag in that case. Modes of kinyan and acquisition, right? So in halacha, to take acquisition of metaltal and of movable objects, I either need to pick it up or to drag it or something like that. Already in the Gemara, they said that if you mark an X on a wine barrel, that is sufficient. So over time, those have been expanded as to what can be counted as minhag and what sorts of things can come in as minhag, up to and including, people talk about bankruptcy law could be the law could be valid in halacha as minhag. In other words, if we're doing business, so I can tell you discussions we have in the Beit Din. If people come in and the whole infrastructure and architecture of their relationship is through the terms and infrastructure of American law, and they've used lawyers, right, to document or partially document transaction. So then we're going to think that minhag is the minhag of the commercial practices of the community and maybe even of the country itself are much, much more dominant. Then if people come in and really are in the Jewish forum and speaking in much more halachic language, etc. I'll give you an example of a case that I was on that was very extreme in demonstrating this, but I think provides an example. So this was a fairly large real estate dispute between frum parties that had many, many different deals. And basically the dispute is about the degree to which one party can withhold some money from deal B because he thinks he was not treated fairly on deal A, effectively. But there were many of them in it. And these deals were generally documented through LLCs and partnership agreements and what I call the plumbing of American law. Some of them even had clauses called a choice of law clause. It says any dispute under this agreement shall be done under the laws of Delaware or of New York. In that case, the Best Man of America says that's what we're going to give. However, the parties had a side deal that of the miser money that they made from their various projects, a certain percentage would be given to a yeshiva that one of the partners is sort of heavily involved in. Okay, so they call that the miser agreement. Now there, they also had a dispute basically over if there were losses from one year and profits from the other year, do you carry over one to the other? And there, our feeling was that, look, even though they're all coming, and this is all the same people, that really, for the disputes that were subject to agreements written and documented under American law, especially if they had clauses that says, please rule under American law, then we're going to give them a much more, a psak that's much more infused by secular law principles and concepts and terms. By contrast, this other thing, in which was clearly done on the side, which maybe even under American law isn't valid because when you have a written agreement, having a side oral agreement could get a little complicated. For the lawyers out there, this is known as the parole evidence rule. But even if it is technically valid, they're clearly there in a different space, right? They're thinking in much more Jewish halakhic terms. And therefore, I think that there was much more of a kind of straight up halakhic analysis. So it's an extreme example because it was in the same case in two very different metrics. But I think like that's a measure of sort of the because it comes from minhag. So we look a lot at the parties' practices and minhagim, and will to a degree that will be certainly a factor in how the psak gets understood, how it gets conceptualized. Now, of course, this all sits, and the Base in America has published some articles on this, that minhag itself is a halachic concept. In other words, that this is the halachically appropriate way to do things. Other Batei Din have, you could imagine, have somewhat more limited conceptions of minhag. These all exist in the Achronim as well. And, exactly how you match these things may be a point of difference.
Meaning, if they have a more limited sense of minhag, here it's talking about minhag of the place where they're living, right? Essentially, minhag becomes a code word, if I understand correctly, for the law itself, right? So in those spaces, they want to broaden the halachic reach, and therefore the minhag becomes minimized.
I think the question is, when do you use a halachic rule, or when would you use a more secular law rule? Sometimes it's about the terminology. We talked before about teachers in institutions, so. Unless you're a head of school in America, the teacher's contract is a year-to-year contract. So there's a case, an administrator came to the school, I think she may have moved her children or whatnot, and did a good job. Everyone thought she was great, but the school had troubles in other areas and therefore decided to clean house. Now, mitzad, the straight-up contract, they don't have to rehire her. They didn't fire her. They just simply didn't rehire her. But in the sort of communal minhag, this is sort of seen as a firing. And especially since for this administrator, we heard from her, and we took testimony from different people, that there's a kind of practice in the schools in this area that an administrator has to be known by a certain date. Okay, and this termination happened, or this non-renewal happened after that date. And therefore, we thought that she should get some compensation for the fact that she could not get another administrator job for the next year because that market moves faster. So we basically gave her some percentage of the difference between a regular teacher makes and what an administrator makes because of the late date of non-renewal. Strictly secular law, I could make an argument how you'd reach the same result, but I think it would be harder because the contract it doesn't give any sort of rights. But I think because halacha does take minhag into account more seriously, I think it balances the minhag versus the text of a contract a little bit differently than American law. I think we reached that result. So it could go either way.
By the way, another realm of law, I think, that gives people an impression that sort of dina de melchut dina, which is we threw out that definition earlier. I mean, we went more with the idea of minhag, but I think often people more likely meet some of these halachic spaces in medical ideas. And in the way that halacha interacts with modern medicine today, is that we really give tremendous preference to what the medical practice is, meaning whether it's even if you can, go back to a case of pregnancy loss, let's say, or abortion, however we're going to define it, it means different things, but that we have in this week's Parsha, that in many of these medical kinds of cases, we really defer most of the judgment to the medical establishment, which of course is its own conversation about the approach to medicine throughout Chazal and Rishonim and Achronim, which is something different. But certainly in the modern medicine we have today, there's a tremendous deference to that. So it's just so interesting to hear about how in different areas of religious life, how there's a different level of deference to the broader system. And you're saying even in one case that you could sit on the Beit Din that has multiple elements to it, each one could be given different yachas, different sort of proportionality to how much weight is given to the halachic system and how much weight is given to the state system, which is
Right.
really
So, for example, I think like a shul and their rabbi, right, is often going to be thought in more halachic terms than two guys who go into business on a real estate venture. Maybe one other thing that's worth mentioning is that almost always, when the parties come to the Beit Din, one of the first things they do before a case gets started is they sign a shtar berurin, right? Or in English, we call it an arbitration agreement. One of the things that does, it sets the reshut ladun, the permission for the Beit Din to rule. And invariably, the formula is, there's different versions, but the one we use in the Beit Din of America is pshara krova ladin. That the authority of the Beit Din is to accomplish pshara, some sort of compromise, but krova ladin, close to the law. That also gives some flexibility to kind of pull things in different ways. So we've often relied on a tshuva from Zalman Nechemia Goldberg, who says, in your pshara krova ladin capacity, you can sometimes expand the damages beyond where the straight halacha would be. Rav Asher Weiss talks about similar ideas in different places, in different ways. So there are these sorts of rooms. So I think that, as you said, the dance is always trying to do both something that is authentically halachic, that has fealty to halacha, but is also reflective of the reality in which you are. One may argue that that is the best halacha. Many cases are like, okay, you have this, business arrangement. It sort of unravels. How do you make order here? In other words, I think having been inside now, I think that these sorts of issues, they're there. They show up here and there, but a lot of times it's just like make lasot sedel pull. And you reach, the places you go are not so different.
I think we're going to be winding down our conversation, but this is really, really so fascinating. And also, to me, it's also healthy to hear about, in Israel, we have such a mess in terms of our modern way where we're trying to figure out how to take a system that we said didn't necessarily function in the systematic way that we're used to in other law systems. And now we're trying to many are trying to make efforts to make it uphold different kinds of systems, or building on Ottoman systems and then adding on a halachic piece. And there are so many layers in the modern Israeli question here that are very, very messy, and that there are many people literally spending their entire lives trying to figure out this kind of tension in again, and not in a case-by-case situation, but actually trying to
and there I'd say I
create
think
a
Israel's
system
ahead of where we are in America in that systematic thinking. I mean, Bate Din do not have think tanks attached to them. If they are attached to Kol, it's a Dayanis Kolel that is, churning through the Simanim and Choshen Mishpat and Evan Answer and what it is. In other words, I think one of the things in Israel, Eretz Tenda, I think does a very good job of this, and they have an affiliated Kollel or I think institute that they really kind of like, and you could say this is an expression of Zionism. In other words, they are system building in a somewhat more systematic way. On the other hand, I think we are trying at the base of America to publish more of our opinions, to be a little bit more transparent of what you're doing. But I do think this takes time. And that's why I said, I think this era that we're living in, because of constellations of shifts in American law, in halachic observance, in Jewish society, and frankly, in Jewish business, and from people having access to serious capital, I think we're in a very pivotal phase of what this is going to look like. And as I said, it's one of the reasons that that I want to study beyond the cases that I sit on, which is, occasionally. I'm not, they have people who do this full time. I kind of get brought in every now and again.
If I may, I wanted to ask you a final question.
Sure.
Um, it's a funny thing, I think, sometimes being inside of a system and also teaching it to those who are not inside the system, right? That's like an interesting
Sure.
headspace and heart space to occupy. I guess I'm curious what for you has been the most meaningful, either like understanding of halakha or takeaway from that experience of kind of teaching Torah and to those who are have great respect for moral systems but aren't inside of the system. I guess I'm curious, like what's been like the most meaningful part of that in this career of yours?
Yeah. So as you said, right, you talk to different audiences. Like I always joke that I could give the same paper as a chabura in a yeshiva, as a paper in a law school, as a paper in Jewish studies, right? And it's all the very different languages used, but it
Yeah.
is the same sort of ideas. You certainly talk and think about it differently. I want to give two stories. Actually, one that happened in Israel because I teach sometimes in Israel, and and one that happened in America. In America, I was teaching. I struggled for many years how to teach, the question of abortion in Jewish law. It's the kind of thing that almost anyone who teaches Jewish law in American law school does, and I think usually because in America we think of that as a very long religion question, and therefore, okay, you're a religion, you're a law, you should have something to say. Of course, halacha does have something to say, but and as you mentioned before, it actually stems from our parsha. But to me, it was always interesting, right? That there's sugyas about lots of things. There's no abortion sugya. You're kind of picking from here and from there, and largely developed in the Achronim based on basically a few stray statements in various sources in the Mishnah on down. And I thought this was then I finally figured out how to teach it, or at least how I now teach it, which is to get back to your question of what do we mean by halachic system? Because abortion is one of these things that if a woman doesn't want to engage anybody else in her decision, she doesn't have to, right? Let's for the moment assume that on the legal side it's easy to do or easy enough to do. In other words, unlike we said before, um, even something like Shabbos, where eventually if I'm Machal Shabbos, there's going to be some sort of communal response, right? This is really can remain between a woman and herself if she wants to. And yet we know that there are women who go and ask shilas and sort of and bring in the halachic voice to this, even though not only is there no state enforcement, there doesn't need to be any social enforcement unless the woman wants to. And I kind of press to the students, sort of like, what's happening here? Why do you think, these largely non-Jewish students, why do you think that this is happening? There's a great piece by Avital Shizik Goldschmidt when she was at the Forward. She interviewed a number of women about their experiences. Um, and it was just a great sort of series of vignettes that we can kind of all come in for. And the students here they really started thinking because they immediately understood that this is both sits there on this like level of it's a very serious decision, very like laden and therefore required, but also in some sense totally optional. And what does it mean to think of a legal system that way? And then we
Mm.
also talk because the post can sort of bring this on of like another way that this area of law is interesting is that you'll have poskim say, Shlomo Zalman famously, "Don't ask me, ask this other posek who had a more mutter opinion," right? Which that makes no sense in secular law, right? Oh, I don't think so, but go ask Judge X, right? That doesn't make any sense. And even the poskim themselves, and the famous tshuva says, I'm not gonna, Nilo Bati and then cites three tshuvas that are matir-ish. It's probably the best way to say it. So we really got them to think about that you could really have a very thick system that is really in some sense private. And what does that mean? So and then they got it. And then I asked the students, I said, well, okay, what if the rabbi goes back into his office and flips a coin? And they said, well, then that wouldn't work. I'm like, right, why not? It's because they want them to feel that they're doing it legit. I'm like, right. And I think there in that like moment in class, we got to something that's we all feel it very, very hard to articulate, certainly in a law school context, right? And it was dafka this area of law because of all the emotional fraughtness of it, and also the unusualness of it, and what's public and what's private, and the halacha itself is a little bit hard to pin down. That really, I think, got the students to like appreciate a little bit of an aspect of the halachic system that is both, in some sense, very familiar and radically different than anything we might call law.
Wow.
The other story happened in Israel, and it was a really interesting conversation. And this was, I don't think it was, they then called it IDC, now it's Reichman, largely a Chiloni school or audience. And I was teaching a short course on Jewish topics, and I talked to them about and one of the things we did was Hilchot Shabbat and Shabbat in the public square, and they reflected what you would think is a sort of like, not anti-dati, but a mainstream Chiloni skepticism of a lot of the questions of public regulation on Shabbat. I don't recall which sub-issue was in the news that day, but, one of them, and they're all sort of the same. And I was like listening and okay, we had an interesting discussion about it. And then the next class I assigned for them, the texts in the New Testament between where Jesus and the Pharisees, like the proto Chazal, are arguing about what we would call Hilchos Shabbos.
Mm-hmm.
And we read them, and the arguments there are basically not so different from the modern arguments, right? The point of Shabbos is made for man, not man for the Shabbos. And they read them, and we were discussing them, and I saw that very, very very like slowly but deliberately, they were moving away from the position that they had the day before, where they were stridently. And once they saw that their position was, I'll call it Jesus-esque, they kind of tilted back. And I said to them, חבר'ה, אני לא מבין, איפה הכבוד שלכם? אתמול הייתם כל כך בטוחים. היום, כי שמעתם שלפני 2000 שנה ישו אמר אותו דבר, אתם נסוגים מזה? מה קרה לכם? And this really broke through a very, very interesting and telling conversation with these Israeli students about questions of halakha, questions of autonomy, questions of the rule of halakha, and sort of the way that fits into Jewish-Christian debates, the way it happens now. It was like a fascinating conversation, but just their like own unease that they were parroting these arguments made them see them differently. So that to me was like a very, very interesting moment, capped by one student saying, which was both the funniest, most ridiculous, but in some sense very insightful line. Wala Yeshu Chiloni. Because for an Israeli
I'll just
Jew,
translate for our audience, right? Yeshu
Jesus
really
was like, well, way
really
secular. Right? Because for an Israeli Jew, religious means to keep Shabbat, and secular means you don't keep Shabbat.
Yeah.
And then when I told her that, well, like many people think he's not just religious, but maybe divine. So these are like fascinating conversations that you couldn't have in America for a bunch of different reasons. The lack of knowledge of anything about Christianity, the approach to what is and isn't Shabbos. So those were sort of two moments in two very different contexts where I think this like inside-outside game, not only to the students, but to me, kind of made me see things in a deeper way.
Professor Chaim Saiman, this has been really fascinating. And I, again, really want to recommend to our audience that they check out the creatively titled book called Halakha. And also
the rabbinic idea of law.
Yes, the rabbinic idea of law. No, because I think that it came up a few episodes ago in the final moments of an episode with Professor Joshua Berman, and where he was also telling a story about where he was speaking with I think they were like ministry students, and also in a conversation with them, and they said to him like, who's the Pope of the Jews? And he said, what do you mean, who's the Pope? We don't have a Pope. And all of a sudden he realized really a very related point that we've touched upon in this conversation as well, which is that, wow, that's so interesting. We don't actually have an authoritative figure like that, meaning we really are a group of people who are, obviously we have rabbinic authority, but it's an authority, as we've said already, that's really self-ascribed and that we place it on ourselves. And I think that there's something so fruitful about being able to sometimes think about ourselves a little bit from the outside. It gives us a lot of perspective. I think it also creates a lot of humility, and I think that it also could
It should.
sometimes it should, and I think it also could provide us with great insight when we jump back into our own map and then we are navigating that system. So thank you so much for helping us sort of straddle that space today,
Sure.
and
Thank
thanks for
you.
being
Thank you for
here.
having me.
Thanks for listening to this week's episode from Matan Women's Institute for Torah Study. If you would like to sponsor an episode, please contact the Matan office or email me at podcast@matan.org.il. Please do us and all women's Torah learning a favor and share this episode with all of your friends and family.